Welcome to another episode of China Update, where I provide you guys with the most up-to-date political, economic and geostrategic analysis on the world's number 2 economy. My name is Tony. Let's jump in. Okay, happy Saturday everybody. I hope you're all enjoying your weekend, getting some well-deserved rest. Let's begin today's video with the housing crisis and what could well be an endgame for the year-long disaster. Late this week, several of China's largest state-owned banks confirmed that they are preparing to pump over $160 billion into Chinese property developers. On Thursday, the Industrial and Commercial Bank of China, ICBC, China's largest lender by assets, announced it's extending credit lines totaling $92 billion to 12 developers. Of course, this is the biggest sign yet that Beijing has decided to back off its now over 2-year-long deleveraging campaign, perhaps concluding that it's bitten off more than it can chew, especially as zero COVID is already a serious headwind for the larger economy. Analysts agree that this move is significant. Quote, "This move is unprecedented. The supportive tone of the property sector is consistent with other measures rolled out this year, but at this time, the vital pivot lies in the direction of strong support to quality developers." End quote. These new lines of credit largely target developers that are seen as stable, or at least relatively stable, including Vanke, Greenland Holdings, and Country Garden, China's largest developer by sales. Markets have been expecting a pivot from Beijing on the housing sector since the announcement of the so-called 16-point property relief plan, which eases deadlines for maturing bank debt and supporting bond issuance. This plan was officially published on Wednesday of this week. Even with this renewed support from Beijing, analysts remain cautious and very far from bullish. Quote, "We expect the fundamental indicators of the real estate industry in 2023 to be steady overall. In 2023, national home sales may grow 2% year-on-year, while real estate investment may recover at a slower pace than sales and may be flat or down slightly from a year ago." End quote. With this pivot from Beijing, the worst of the crisis, or at least this crisis, could be over in the short term, but in the long term, structural issues remain, and it's important that we take a step back and survey the forest from the trees. Quote, "It is important to remember that while the liquidity clampdown in 2020-2021 was the trigger for the real estate crisis, it wasn't the cause. The cause was decades of out-of-control property sector growth that left China with a too large property sector delivering more new floor space than the country could reasonably absorb, surging property-related debt, and the highest real estate prices in the world. That means the policies designed to limit the liquidity component of the crisis may help slow the pace of contraction, but they won't resolve the underlying problem. The best they can do, although unlikely, is temporarily reignite the property bubble. But this doesn't mean this is a bad idea. From an economic point of view, it would be best to resolve the property crisis as quickly as possible, but for social and political stability, it makes sense to slow what has so far been a brutal adjustment to a more manageable pace. In the end, however, if Chinese households don't return to the bad old days of frenzied property purchasing, rising prices and soaring debt, the property sector must continue to be a major drag on economic activity, government finances, and household savings." End quote. And while we are on the housing crisis, let's touch on land use sales, which is also related to our second topic for today's video, local government fiscal conditions. Chinese financial media outlet Caixin writes today that multiple major cities in China will not be able to complete their annual land sales plans, that is, land use sales plans, quote, "as cash-strapped property developers are still reluctant to buy despite a raft of supportive government policies." End quote. The outlet reports that this year 22 cities, including the major ones, Beijing, Shanghai, and provincial capitals, plan to offer over 31,000 acres of land for centralized auction, but only 55% of the property has been sold, with a little more than a month left in the year. The outlet reminds us that Chinese cities generate a significant share of their annual budgets from sales of land use rights. According to real estate research firm China Index Academy, only 4 cities, Hefei, provincial capital of Anhui, Wuxi in Jiangsu province, Shanghai and Xiamen in Fujian province, have completed their 2022 land auction plans. The firm estimates that by the end of this year, the 22 cities are expected to have only completed about 60% of their land planned sales. Caixin touches on a disquieting theme too, which we have been following for some time, writing that as private property businesses have been reluctant to bid, quote, state-owned enterprises, including local government financing vehicles, are the main land buyers. From February 2021 to the end of the third quarter of 2022, local government financing vehicles brought 1,300 parcels, accounting for 41% of the total of land auctioned off. End quote. In Suzhou, Jinan, and Nanjing, all major cities, more than 80% of the land was purchased by local government financing vehicles last month in October. An incredible figure. We remember earlier this year, central government regulators criticized this practice for being unsustainable and destabilizing, directing localities to discontinue it, and largely being ignored. Now this brings us nicely to our next development for today's video, local government debt. Hey guys, if you enjoyed the episode, don't forget to hit that like button. And as always, anyone who can go that extra mile and help me keep China Update sustainable, this is primarily what I rely on to allow me to continue making these episodes every day. Patreon and Buy Me a Coffee links are in the description below. Thank you so much for everyone who already does this. It's a tremendous help. If it wasn't for you guys, I simply would not be able to justify doing this sort of work on top of my regular roles. So thank you so much for the support. Okay, analysts are becoming increasingly concerned about the sustainability of local government debt accumulation. Though hardly a crisis at this point, the trends, if not adjusted, are certainly heading that way. Bloomberg economists point out this week that China's 31 provincial level governments have an officially recognized stockpile of outstanding bonds, nearing its Ministry of Finance's risk threshold of 120% of income. Breaching that line, the economists explain, could mean regions will face more regulatory hurdles to borrowing. Of course, some localities are in a much healthier position, with plenty of breathing space for borrowing, while others are at emergency debt levels. For example, the northern port city of Tianjin's outstanding debt reached 207% of its overall income last year. In addition to total debt levels, local authorities will face a massive maturity wall over the next 5 years as bonds worth almost 15 trillion RMB, $2.1 trillion US, more than 40% of their outstanding debt, fall due. Indeed, at an October meeting of the Standing Committee of the National People's Congress, some delegates warned local government debt maturing in the next couple of years would, quote, be difficult to repay as scheduled, end quote, calling for contingency plans to be made early. Bloomberg writes, quote, while there's little risk of provincial governments defaulting, they will run into increasing difficulty in repaying their debts. More and more bonds will need to be sold to roll over maturing ones rather than to finance new spending, and as a result, investment growth may suffer. End quote. We remember from previous videos that local fiscal conditions have been shaken this year by the dual hit on the revenue side of tax breaks and the crash of land use sales, which we just touched on, and on the expenditure side with expensive zero-COVID measures. Indeed, the official local government debt-to-income ratio has surged since the start of the pandemic, jumping to 118% of income by the end of September this year, from only 83% in 2019. Some economists argue that China can take on more debt, they just need to reform the mechanisms for accumulation. Quote, it should be the central government rather than the provinces to add leverage. Regional finances have turned quite weak over the past few years. The government will come under more and more pressure to make the change. It is a matter of time. End quote. Though he does recognize that China's broad fiscal deficit will reach 7.3% of GDP this year if we include the issuance of special purpose bonds, conceding, quote, such a high ratio is unsustainable. End quote. Others advise a more cautious approach. Quote, the stubbornly faster growth of explicit government borrowing than the authorities' financial resources means their debt pressure will continue to rise. that will pose new challenges to the room for fiscal policy in future and fiscal health and stability." End quote. Bloomberg's economists also observed that even interest payouts are a growing problem. Interest payments on special bonds reached 479 billion RMB in the first 9 months of this year, equivalent to 6.2% of spending under the government fund budget. A level above 10% will trigger fiscal restructuring. Okay, that is today's episode of China Update. Thank you so much, everybody, for watching. Have a wonderful weekend, and I will see you all on Monday.